The circulatory system works to transport oxygen and nutrients to cells in your body, while removing waste products such as carbon dioxide at the same time. Hemoglobin, which is the protein present in red blood cells, serves as the main transporter, much like a school bus, with oxygen and carbon dioxide being able to hop on or hop off at the correct destinations. This system is actually a double circulatory system, made of two circuits, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. In the pulmonary circuit, deoxygenated blood is pumped from your heart to your lungs to become oxygenated. In the systemic circuit, this oxygenated blood that is returned to the heart is pumped to the rest of your body. Unlike other muscles in your body, your heart never tires and works very hard to ensure that blood reaches all parts from your head to your toes. Blood is pumped away through the aorta and then through the arteries. Arteries have very thick muscular walls so to withstand the pressure of very fast-flowing blood. These arteries branch into smaller arterioles, which then branch into smaller capillaries that surround all cells. The movement of blood slows down significantly at the capillaries for two reasons. The capillaries are much smaller, and slower movement allows for gas exchange. Here, oxygen is offloaded onto cells, so blood becomes deoxygenated and carbon dioxide and other waste products are picked up. Deoxygenated blood then travels away from the capillaries into the venules and then into the veins. Unlike arteries, veins have much thinner walls and valves that prevent deoxygenated blood from flowing backwards. This deoxygenated blood doesn't travel straight to the lungs to become oxygenated. It must first travel to the heart so it can be pumped into the lungs, ready for another round.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Comment below if you have any questions. Why not check out our FISIOLOGI app as well? Until next time.
Your heart is a pump. It's a muscular organ about the size of your fist and is located slightly left of center in your chest. Your heart is divided into the right and left side. The division protects oxygen-rich blood from mixing with oxygen-poor blood. Together, your heart and blood vessels comprise your cardiovascular system, which circulates blood and oxygen around your body. In fact, your heart pumps about 5 quarts of blood every minute, and it beats about 100,000 times in one day. That's about 35 million times in a year. Oxygen-poor blood, blue blood, returns to the heart after circulating through your body. The right side of the heart, composed of the right atrium and ventricle, collects and pumps the blood to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries. The lungs refresh the blood with a new supply of oxygen, making it turn red. Oxygen-rich blood, red blood, then enters the left side of the heart, composed of the left atrium and ventricle, and is pumped through the aorta to the body to supply tissues with oxygen. 4 valves within your heart keep your blood moving the right way. The tricuspid, mitral, pulmonary, and aortic valves work like gates on a fence They open only one way and only when pushed on. Each valve opens and closes once per heartbeat, or about once every second. A beating heart contracts and relaxes. Contraction is called systole, and relaxing is called diastole. During systole, your ventricles contract, forcing blood into the vessels going to your lungs and body, much like ketchup being forced out of a squeeze bottle. The right ventricle contracts a little bit before the left ventricle does. Your ventricles then relax during diastole and are filled with blood coming from the upper chambers, the left and right atria. Then the cycle starts over again. Your heart is nourished by blood too. Blood vessels called coronary arteries extend over the surface of your heart and branch into smaller capillaries. Here you can see just the network of blood vessels that feed your heart with oxygen-rich blood. Your heart also has electrical wiring, which keeps it beating. Electrical impulses begin high in the right atrium and travel through specialized pathways to the ventricles, delivering the signal to pump. The conduction system keeps your heart beating in a coordinated and normal rhythm, which in turn keeps blood circulating. The continuous exchange of oxygen-rich blood with oxygen-poor blood is what keeps you alive.
If you put a stethoscope over the chest, you'll usually hear something that sounds like lub-dub, 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 which repeats over and over again with each cardiac cycle or heartbeat. Now, the question is, where does this sound come from? Normally, blood is constantly moving through the four chambers of the heart, coming through the veins into the right atrium, going to the right ventricle, then shooting off via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs and coming back from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and then to the left ventricle to be pumped into the aorta. So in every step, some valves have to open and some have to close. Valves are basically just communicating doors that, when open, allow blood to pass through, and when closed, hold blood within a chamber. So in total, our heart has 4 valves. 2 atrioventricular valves, which separate the atria from the ventricles and are the mitral valve on the left side and the tricuspid valve on the right side, and 2 semilunar valves, which separate the ventricles from the large arteries coming off of them and are the pulmonary valve on the right side and the aortic valve on the left side. And when these valves are closing, just like a door slamming shut, they're going to make a sound that's transmitted in the direction of the blood flow. Now, the heart is positioned in such a way that the sound of the closing of each of these valves is projected onto a small area on the chest wall. If you put a stethoscope between the second and third rib, known as the right second intercostal space, just next to the upper border of the sternum, you'll hear the aortic valve closing. Then if you place a stethoscope in the left second intercostal space, at the left upper sternal border, you can hear the pulmonary valve closing. Making our way down between the fourth and fifth rib, next to the left lower border of the sternum, is where you can best hear the tricuspid valve closing. Finally, let's move down to between the fifth and sixth rib, so in the left fifth intercostal space, near the midclavicular line. The midclavicular line is the imaginary line that gets drawn from the midpoint of the left clavicle, or the collarbone, straight down, so you can find where it intersects with the fifth intercostal space. That's where the mitral valve closing is best heard. Now, in reality, a lot of these things are happening at once, like a factory with lots of things happening in parallel. For example, the right and left atria are both full of blood, and that blood moves through the tricuspid and the mitral valve to get down into the ventricles. Initially, the blood flows passively into the ventricles, but near the end, when there's just a bit left, there's an atrial contraction that gives the blood an extra hard push to help get it out. This part of the heartbeat, when blood is filling the relaxed ventricles, is called diastole. Now, once the ventricles have filled up, both of the atrioventricular valves snap shut, creating a long, loud sound that sounds a bit like lub. And that's the first heart sound, or S1. And because it's basically the tricuspid and mitral valve closing, it's best heard in the tricuspid valve and mitral valve areas. So at this point, the ventricles are full of a whole lot of blood and are ready to squeeze it out. And to do that, the aortic valve on the left side and the pulmonic valve on the right side quietly open up. Blood flows from the left ventricle into the aorta and from the right ventricle into the pulmonary arteries. This part of the heartbeat, when the ventricles contract and push blood out, is called systole. Eventually, the ventricles finish squeezing, so these two valves close down, making a short, sharp sound that sounds a bit like a dub. And this dub is called the second heart sound, or S2. This is heard loudest in the aortic valve and pulmonary valve areas. During inspiration, though, if you listen carefully with a stethoscope, this S2 sound actually splits into two separate sounds. That's because the diaphragm muscles lower during inspiration, and that creates negative pressure in the chest to bring in air. And that negative pressure also brings a bit more venous blood back to the right atrium and right ventricle. It takes a little bit longer for the right ventricle to squeeze the extra blood into the pulmonary arteries, and it takes a little bit longer for the pulmonary valve to close. So during inspiration, the closing of the pulmonary valve is heard slightly later than the aortic valve, and that's called the physiologic splitting of the S2. Now, after both the aortic and pulmonary valves have shut down, the atrioventricular valves open up again, letting the cycle start all over. Alright, as a quick recap. Heart sounds are generated as blood flows through the beating heart. There are two normal heart sounds. S1, caused by the atrioventricular valves closing at the beginning of systole, and S2, caused by the aortic and pulmonary valves closing at the beginning of diastole.
Hey guys, thanks for watching that video on normal heart sounds. I hope you found it helpful. So thanks to the team that worked on it. The script was written by Antonia. The script was then edited by Rishi. I did the illustrations, Tanner did the voiceover, and Sam did the video editing. So if you like this video and other videos we have like it on YouTube, you should definitely check us out on osmosis.org. Over there we have over 100 exclusive videos that are not released here on YouTube, as well as a ton of studying tools. So things like flashcards, practice problems, and even textbooks. And of course you can always find us on social media, so places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and even Patreon if you'd like to help us out directly. So I hope you found this video helpful. I look forward to the next one I get to work on. See you then. Bye.
Conducting system of the heart. Components. The conducting system of the heart is made up of specialized cardiac muscle fibers and is responsible for initiation and conduction of cardiac impulse. The conducting system of the heart consists of the following 5 components: sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, atrioventricular bundle, right and left branches of bundle of His, subendocardial Purkinje fibers. Sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial node is also known as node of Keith-Flack. It is a small horseshoe-shaped mass having specialized myocardial fibers situated in the wall of the right atrium in the upper part of sulcus terminalis, just below the opening of the superior vena cava. It is known as pacemaker of the heart because it generates impulses about 70 per minute and initiates the contraction of cardiac muscle, producing a heartbeat. Atrioventricular node is also known as node of Tauera. It is smaller than the SA node and is located in the lower part of the atrial septum, just above the attachment of septal cusp of the tricuspid valve or opening of the coronary sinus. It conducts the cardiac impulse to the ventricle by the atrioventricular bundle. The AV node is capable of generating impulses at a rate of about 60 per minute. The speed of conduction of cardiac impulse, which is about 0.11 seconds, provides sufficient time to the atria to empty their blood into the ventricle before ventricles start contracting. Atrioventricular bundle. It begins from the AV node, crosses the AV ring, and runs along the inferior part of the membranous part of the interventricular septum, where it divides into the left and right branches. Since the skeleton, which is a fibrous framework of the heart, separates the muscles of atria from the muscles of the ventricles, the bundle of His is the only means of conducting impulses from the atria to the ventricles. Right and left branches of the bundle of His. The right branch passes down to the right side of the interventricular septum and then becomes subendocardial on the right side of the septum. A large part of it continues in the septomarginal trabeculum to reach the anterior papillary muscle and anterior wall of the ventricle. Its Purkinje fibers then spread out beneath the endocardium. The left branch descends on the left side of the ventricular septum, divides into Purkinje fibers which are distributed to the septum and left ventricle. Purkinje fibers. They are the terminal branches of the right and left branches of the bundle of His and spread subendocardially over the septum and the rest of the ventricular wall. The conducting system and mode of contraction of cardiac muscle is summarized as follows. The SA node, a spontaneous source of cardiac impulse, initiates an impulse which rapidly spreads to the muscles of the atria, making them contract. The AV node picks up the cardiac impulse from atria and conducts it through the atrioventricular bundle and its branches to the papillary muscles and the walls of the ventricles. The papillary muscles contract first to tighten the chordae tendineae, and then the contraction of the ventricular muscle occurs. Arterial supply of the conducting system. The whole of the conducting system of the heart is supplied by the right coronary artery except a part of the left branch of the AV bundle which is supplied by the left coronary artery. Clinical correlation. Conducting system defects. The defect or damage of conducting system causes cardiac arrhythmias. The SA node is the spontaneous source of generation of cardiac impulses. The AV node picks up these impulses from atria and sends them to the ventricles through AV bundle, the only means through which impulses can spread from the atria to ventricles. If the AV bundle fails to conduct normal impulses, there is alteration in the rhythmic contraction of the ventricle, which is known as arrhythmias. If complete bundle block occurs, there is complete dissociation in the rate of contraction of atria and ventricles. The commonest cause of defective conduction through AV bundle is atherosclerosis of coronary arteries, which leads to diminished blood supply to the conducting system. An important point to be noted here is that rapid pulse is called tachycardia, the slow pulse is called bradycardia, whereas irregular pulse is called arrhythmia.
In our last video, we introduced the circulatory system and saw how the heart acts as the system's pump. In this video, though, we'll take a closer look at the blood vessels, specifically the arteries, capillaries, and veins. To quickly summarize, the arteries carry blood away from the heart. The capillaries exchange nutrients and oxygen with the tissues, and veins carry the blood back to the heart. As you take a closer look at each, the key thing to notice is how the structure of each type of vessel is related to its function. As arteries carry blood directly from the heart, the blood inside them is going to be at really high pressures, because it's just been pumped out to the ventricles. In order to bear these high pressures, the arteries need to be both strong and elastic. And to achieve this, they have a thick layer of muscle tissue to keep them strong, and a thick layer of elastic tissue so that they can stretch and recoil. These two layers, though, mean that the wall of the artery is quite thick when compared to its lumen, which is what we call the hole or space in the middle of the vessel. Once the arteries have transported the blood to the different parts of the body, it enters the capillaries. These vessels are really small and come into close contact with all of the cells in our body. Their role is to exchange substances with our cells, giving them useful nutrients and oxygen, and taking away waste products like carbon dioxide. If we take a closer look at a single capillary, we can see how they're adapted to this function. For example, their walls are only a single cell thick, and they're also permeable, which means that substances can easily diffuse through them. Because they're so tiny, the lumen of an individual capillary is also tiny. But there are so many of them that their total cross-sectional area, which is just the area of all the capillaries added together, is actually huge, far higher than for arteries. This means that the pressure of the blood is much lower than in the arteries, and so it flows more slowly, which gives the blood time to exchange things with the tissues. Finally, these tiny capillaries start to join up into larger vessels called veins, which transport the blood back to the heart. Veins are relatively large, with by far the biggest lumens of any blood vessels. They also have relatively thin walls, with only small layers of elastic fibers and smooth muscle. This works fine though, because the blood that they carry is at very low pressures, so the walls don't need to be very strong. The important thing to remember about veins though is that they have valves, which prevent blood from flowing backwards, ensuring that it always flows towards the heart. Before we finish, let's quickly cover how to calculate the rate of blood flow. A typical question could look something like this. 2,560 ml of blood passes through the aorta, which is the big artery that leaves the heart, in 8 minutes. Calculate the rate of blood flow through the aorta in milliliters per minute. So in a question like this, we would just divide how much blood has flowed, so 2,560, by the time it took, so 8 minutes, which gives us 320 milliliters per minute. And that's all for the blood vessels. If you haven't seen our other videos on the heart and the blood yet, we put the links for those in the description below. Otherwise, cheers for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Both arteries and veins are tubes made of 4 layers. A protective fibrous covering, a middle layer of smooth muscle and elastic fibers, and an inner layer of connective tissue lined with a smooth layer of cells. Arteries have a thicker muscle layer to withstand the greater blood pressure. Veins are wider and adapt to the changing volume of blood. Blood flows slowly through veins because it has little pressure behind it. Blood flow in the veins relies on the rhythmic contraction of surrounding muscles and the pumping action of nearby arteries to return it to the heart. One-way semilunar valves, which occur at intervals inside the veins, prevent any possible backflow of blood.
Arteriosclerosis. clot forms as a result. This clot is known as thrombus and prevents the blood flow in the arteries.
Veins contain one-way valves that work in conjunction with skeletal muscles. When the skeletal muscles contract, the valves open, and blood is forced toward the heart. When the skeletal muscles relax, the valves close to prevent the backflow of blood away from the heart.
Did you know your body has its own version of a sewer system for removing unwanted toxins, waste, and excess water from the body? This is called our lymphatic system. Like our blood circulation, the lymphatic system is made up of millions of little vessels that branch all around our body. But whereas arteries and veins carry blood, the lymphatic vessels are much, much finer and carry a colourless fluid called lymph. Our lymphatic system has three main duties. 1. It contains white blood cells called lymphocytes, which are used to fight infection. 2. It acts as a one-way drainage system, transporting fluid from body tissues into the blood circulation. 3. It gets rid of waste products produced by cells. As blood circulates the body, plasma leaves the blood vessels and travels into the body tissues, delivering food, oxygen, and hormones to the cells. This plasma becomes tissue fluid and surrounds all our body's tissues. It then collects waste products, excess water, and toxins from the cells. 90% of this fluid passes back into the blood circulation. However, 10% of the fluid is left behind and is known as lymph. We therefore need a system to drain this lymph fluid, so that we don't end up as a swollen fluid-filled balloon, hence the lymphatic system. The lymph fluid drains into lymph vessels, where it then travels to lymph nodes, which are found all around your body. To stop backflow, the lymph vessels have one-way valves and muscular walls that contract to force the lymph forward. This is happening in millions of little lymphatic vessels in your body every minute of every day. The lymph nodes filter the lymph, destroying or trapping anything harmful. The lymph nodes contain white blood cells called lymphocytes, which attack and break down bacteria, viruses, damaged cells, or cancer cells. This filtering and destroying is an important part of our immune system and stops nasty substances being fed back into our bloodstream, which would make us sick. The waste products and destroyed bacteria are then carried in the lymph fluid through larger lymph vessels up to your neck, where the thoracic duct empties the lymph back into the blood circulation. The bloodstream then removes the waste products from the body as it does with other waste. As well as the lymph fluid, our lymphatic system also includes a few organs: the spleen, thymus, tonsils, and adenoids. They all have roles in helping our body fight off infections. Unfortunately, like any sewer system, things can go horribly wrong. Sometimes we get infections that cause the pumping to break down. This can cause your arms or legs to swell to huge proportions. Sometimes the debris or other bad substances can make it past lymph nodes. Sometimes cancer cells do this and spread the cancer to other parts of the body, which obviously isn't good. For now, we wish you all the best for your lymphatic health, which you can help maintain by drinking lots of water and exercising. Keep on pumping.
If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Comment below if you have any questions. Why not check out our FISIOLOGI app as well? Until next time.
Hello friends, today we'll learn about blood. Blood is essential to keep everyone alive. It carries nutrients and oxygen to the cells in the body. Blood carries waste materials to the lungs, kidneys, and digestive system to be removed from the body. It also fights infections and carries hormones. There are various components to blood: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Let's understand about each. Plasma. It is the yellowish liquid portion of blood. Plasma is the single largest component of human blood, comprising approximately 55%. It contains water, salts, antibodies, enzymes, and some proteins. Red blood cells. Red blood cells are also called erythrocytes, or RBC. It comprises about 45% of blood. They contain a protein called hemoglobin that carries oxygen. Blood gets its vibrant red color when hemoglobin picks up oxygen in the lungs. Red blood cells live for about 120 days. Every day, the body makes new RBCs to replace those that die. RBCs are produced in the soft, fatty tissue inside bone cavities called bone marrow. White blood cells. White blood cells are also called leukocytes, or WBC. These are the cells of the immune system which are involved in protecting the body against foreign invaders and infectious diseases. White blood cells are derived from multipotent cells in the bone marrow called hematopoietic stem cells. Platelets. If one of your blood vessels gets damaged, it sends out signals that are picked up by the tiny platelets. The platelets then rush to the site of damage and form a clot to repair the damage. Now it's time to learn how blood flows in the body. Oxygen you breathe in from the air passes through the lungs into your blood through tiny capillaries in the lungs. Oxygen-rich blood travels through your pulmonary veins to the left side of your heart and out of the aorta to the rest of the body. There are 8 blood types: A negative, A positive, B negative, B positive, O negative, O positive, AB negative, and AB positive. We should eat dried fruits, green vegetables, beans, whole grains, low-fat dairy, etc. to keep the blood healthy and clean. Now, you know a lot about blood. Please drop a like, leave a comment, share the videos, and don't forget to subscribe. Bye-bye.
Usually, every time you have a cut or bruise, your blood clots to stop the bleeding. Clotting is a complex process, and there are 4 main things that make it possible: platelets, or cell fragments; clotting factors, which are special proteins; fibrin, which is a protein like red and white blood cells. Because clot formation is so important, platelets and clotting factors are always available, floating around in your blood. Now, let's talk about the 4 steps involved with forming a tear in a blood vessel. The first thing that happens is that the nearby platelets are activated and become sticky. They start sticking to each other and to the sides of the hole in the blood vessel. For small holes, enough platelets usually stick together to form a temporary plug. But a platelet plug is flowing past the hole could wash the plug away. These other materials are called clotting factors. As the clotting factors float by the tear, they become activated or turned on and add themselves to the plug, weave itself together with others of the same kind, and form a web of fibrous tissue called fibrin. This web acts like glue and holds the platelets and the other clotting factors together, creating a blood clot. Other cells, like red and white blood cells, in the blood vessel together.
After the clot has formed, it stays in the hole until the tissue is repaired. When the clot is no longer needed, your body dissolves it.
The goal of this lecture is to introduce you to the different types of circulatory systems that we can find in organisms. So there are there are two main types of circulatory systems, and then some animals who can live without circulatory systems. So we'll talk about the ones without circulatory systems first. Then we'll talk about what's called an open circulatory system, where we have open-ended vessels that bathe the tissues directly in the circulatory fluid. And then we'll talk about closed circulatory systems, which is what we observe in us, for example. So not all animals are going to have to rely on a circulatory system because they are small, very small, or they are flat and can just rely strictly on diffusion to get in key nutrients to their body. Now, you're going to find organisms with no circulatory system to live in aqueous environments. So they're going to be aquatic in some way, and what they're going to do is they're going to get those gases and nutrients by diffusion from the environment into their body. So these are going to be very small, like on the far left we have a rotifer, in the middle this is a tapeworm, and then on the right is a jellyfish. And so these are very small, the rotifers are very small, you can see the tapeworms are thin and flat, and then with the jellyfish, what we see is that they put their active tissues on the outside of their body, allowing them to directly interact with the surrounding water. But we know this doesn't work in large animals because remember that you can only be a few cell layers thick for diffusion to really be as an effective means of getting oxygen or nutrients to all of your body cells. And so what we see is the evolution of circulatory systems that contain some sort of transport tissue. So blood and hemolymph, which we'll be talking about, are technically considered connective tissues in the body, and they are going to reach every single cell of the body either by directly bathing those cells in open circulatory systems or by vessels branching to the point of such a fine point that they come into contact with every cell like we see in closed circulatory systems. So open circulatory systems, we find these in insects and in mollusks such as clams, and their connective tissue, their fluid connective tissue is called hemolymph. Now what's interesting about hemolymph is that it does not stay contained to vessels. So what we see is if we look at the diagram on the right here, you see that there is a heart here, and we do have vessels, but the vessels are open-ended. And so what happens is that the fluid gets drawn in, and then the heart pumps it, and then the fluid goes out and bathes the tissues directly with the hemolymph. Now I just want to mention here that for some of these organisms, such as mollusks, they do have gills that the hemolymph will pass over to help pick up oxygen, and then it will move into the vessel to be pumped out again and directly over the tissues. So what we see is that we can have simple hearts that help to pump and circulate the hemolymph. Sometimes muscular movement is also adequate enough to help move the hemolymph around. And once again, these are open spaces where you have to bathe all of the cells in the hemolymph to help carry nutrients in some organisms, and then nutrients and oxygen in others. And so we have to keep moving it around and circulating it to make sure that it's reaching all of the cells. Now, because the vessels are open, hemolymph is under what we consider low pressure, and there really is no way to control where the fluid goes. So, for example, like in clams, with pumping, it just sort of goes all over the tissues. so this is not a problem, especially if you're like a clam stuck to a certain a certain spot. You're not moving around, you're sedentary, you don't have high oxygen requirements like some other organisms might. And so this undirected movement of hemolymph is normally not a problem. But, we see some very active organisms that are utilizing hemolymph as their circulatory system. So, for example, in insects, remember I mentioned they do not use their circulatory system for respiration. So what they have is they have their hemolymph bathing their tissues to help carry nutrients around. But then they utilize their tracheal system to branch to their individual cells to get oxygen to them. And so this tracheal system helps overcome the low pressure hemolymph by allowing oxygen to get directly to the cells, which is good for their lifestyle in that they're flying, they have rapid movements, and so the insects not relying on their circulatory system is absolutely all right because they have their very specialized respiratory system. Now, other crustaceans, for example, that we see, such as a crawfish, if we see this here, they have gills. And so what they do is that their hemolymph will pass over their gills to help pick up oxygen, but these are still active, they swim around, and so they have these open-ended vessels, these smaller branching open-ended vessels that help to direct the hemolymph more directly to the active tissue. So for example, if you look at the crawfish here, we see these little blue vessels at the back end of the crawfish, open-ended vessels. So those are being directed to the muscles of the tail to help that crawfish be able to facilitate rapid movements with the tail. So you also see little vessels coming off down here on the bottom. If you look towards the legs, you see little vessels going to like each little leg. And so this is helping to direct the hemolymph to help get the oxygen to their more energetic needed tissues. Okay, so stop and think for a second. What is the connective tissue found in open circulatory systems? And of course, the answer here is going to be hemolymph. Okay, so when you have an open circulatory system, remember the hemolymph is directly bathing the tissues. And I just want to remind you again that in some organisms, hemolymph carries both nutrients and oxygen. So for example, like in the crawfish or in the clams, while in insects, the hemolymph is only carrying nutrients. They rely on their tracheal system for oxygen. This is something that gets students every year, so just make sure you keep that in mind. Now the next type of circulatory system we're going to talk about are closed circulatory systems. And the connective tissue found in closed circulatory systems is what we typically call blood. And so it's going to be confined to a vascular setup to where you have no open-ended vessels. The vessels are all connected to one another in some way and are all connected to a muscular heart. And so that muscular heart helps to move the blood through the closed circulatory system vessels. So we have this conflict that occurs in closed circulatory systems. So you need enough pressure to be generated by your muscular pump, so your hump, to be able to overcome resistance of the vessel. So you can imagine that, if you're trying to pump blood all the way to your toes, there's going to be a lot more resistance because you have a lot more length of vessel to travel to. So you need to have enough positive pressure to move the blood all the way through those vessels. But then you also have to have a way for the blood to slow down enough for gas exchange to occur with the tissues. And so we'll see that the blood pressure and flow rate will drop drastically once the blood hits the small vessels to help facilitate the necessary gas exchange for cellular respiration. So there are two major advantages to closed circulatory systems. So first of all is that we're constantly going to be able to direct oxygen to the tissues that need them. Every single cell is going to come in contact with the capillary, and so oxygen can be delivered at a high rate. We can also vary blood flow to tissues based on the need. So we sort of talked about this when we talked about the pressure equation and how we can change resistance. And if you want to have blood flow to a tissue, you can dilate vessels. If you want to restrict blood flow, you can constrict vessels. And so we can actually be more directive in where we're sending blood in the body versus, for example, the sedentary open circulatory system organisms where you have no way to direct the connective tissue flow. Closed circulatory systems are found in vertebrates, they're found in annelid worms, and they're found in cephalopod mollusks, so things like cuttlefish and octopi and squids. So which one of these organisms does not have a closed circulatory system? So take a quick look and see. And the answer here is going to be the fly. So the fly has an open circulatory system, and just a reminder that they rely on their tracheal system for supplying oxygen.
The roles of the circulatory system are to transport essential metabolites from the fat body to the cells, carry waste to the excretory system, and provide immunity to harmful organisms. Insects have a simple, open circulatory system. The circulatory system consists of a dorsal vessel running the length of the body. The dorsal vessel is divided into a posterior heart that contains intake valves called ostia and an anterior aorta. The open space of the body is called the hemocoel. The hemocoel is filled with insect blood called hemolymph. Since insect hemolymph does not transport oxygen, it does not contain hemoglobin, and therefore lacks the red color that is characteristic of blood from vertebrate animals. Hemolymph is pumped forward by the heart through the aorta into the head and flows back through the body in the open hemocoel. Hemolymph re-enters the posterior heart through the ostial valves, and the cycle repeats. The hemocoel is always full of hemolymph, and the heart ensures its mixing. Auxiliary pulsatile hearts at the base of the antennae, legs, and wings pump hemolymph into those appendages.
At the arterial end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is 13 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is minus 7 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. Approximately 9/10 of the fluid that leaves the capillary at its arterial end re-enters the capillary at the venous end. About 1/10 of the fluid passes into the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system.